While the world was consumed by the fire of World War II, Native American men stepped forward not as outsiders, but as defenders of a nation that had never fully defended them. Over 44,000 Native Americans served in the U.S. military during the war. They came from many nations: Navajo, Lakota, Dakota, each carrying generations of warrior tradition into a modern global conflict. Some became part of one of the most critical and secretive operations of the war, the Navajo Code Talkers. Using their language, they created an unbreakable code that the enemy could not decipher. In the chaos of battle, their voices carried life-saving messages across the Pacific. Their contribution was not symbolic, it was decisive. But while these men fought across oceans, another battle continued quietly at home. For decades before the war, U.S. policy had been shaped by forced assimilation. Central to this system were the Indian boarding schools, institutions designed to remove Native children from their cultural roots. By the 1940s, this system was still active. Children were taken sometimes through pressure, sometimes by force from reservations and placed into distant schools. Their everything familiar was stripped away. Their hair was cut, their traditional clothing replaced, their languages forbidden, even their names were changed. The goal was clear and openly stated in earlier years: to civilize the child by erasing the identity they were born into. So while Native soldiers wore U.S. uniforms abroad, their children were being reshaped into something unrecognizable at home. When the war ended, many of these men returned not to celebration, but to confusion and loss. Some found that their children no longer spoke their language. Others discovered emotional distance that could not easily be repaired. The cost of war, for them, was not only what they witnessed overseas, but what had changed in their absence. This was not an isolated injustice. It was part of a broader system that spanned generations. Yet, even under this pressure, Native communities did not disappear. They adapted. They resisted quietly. Traditions were preserved in hidden ways through stories, ceremonies, and memory. And today, many Native nations are actively reclaiming what was nearly erased, reviving languages, restoring identity, and confronting this history with truth. Because this story is not only about loss, it is about endurance. They fought for a country during its darkest hour, and despite everything that was taken, they never lost the one thing that could not be erased: their identity. As the United States mobilized for World War II, Native American communities responded with a level of commitment that few expected and even fewer fully understood. From remote reservations to growing cities, young Native men stepped forward, not because they were treated as equals, but because they carried a deeper sense of duty rooted in tradition, honor, and identity. By the end of the war, more than 44,000 Native Americans had served in the U.S. military. It was one of the highest participation rates per capita of any group in the country. Many came from nations like the Navajo, Cherokee, and Choctaw, each with long histories of warrior culture, now carried into a global war. Their roles were not limited to the front lines. Some became scouts, medics, engineers. Others became something even more critical: voices in a war where communication meant survival. The Navajo Code Talkers developed a code based on their language that proved impossible for enemy forces to break. In battles across the Pacific, their transmissions coordinated troop movements, called in artillery, and saved countless lives. Their contribution was so effective that it remained classified for years after the war. Yet, their loyalty ran deeper than strategy. Many Native soldiers believed they were fighting for something beyond the United States government. They were fighting for land, for legacy, for a future where their people might finally be seen, respected, and allowed to exist without pressure to change who they were. In their minds, service was not just about the present war, it was about generations yet to come. But that belief stood in quiet tension with reality. At the time, Native Americans still faced systemic inequality. Many did not have full access to basic rights. On reservations, poverty and federal control shaped daily life. And while these men wore the uniform overseas, Policies rooted in assimilation continued at home, affecting their families in ways they could not see from the battlefield. This is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. They fought for freedom in foreign lands, while their own communities were still navigating restrictions imposed by the very nation they served. They defended a country built on ideals of liberty, even as those ideals were unevenly applied to their own people. They fought for a country that didn't fully protect their own families, and yet they still fought, not out of blind loyalty but out of strength, resilience, and a belief that their service might one day help reshape the future for those they left behind. While Native American soldiers crossed oceans to fight in World War II, another conflict continued quietly within the borders of the United States, a system that did not use bombs or guns, but policies and institutions designed to reshape a people from within. For decades leading into the 1940s, the U.S. government, often working alongside religious organizations, operated a network of Indian boarding schools. These schools were not simply places of education. They were instruments of forced assimilation. Their purpose was clear: remove Native children from their families and erase the cultural identity they carried. By the time the war began, this system was already deeply rooted. On reservations and in Native communities, agents and officials enforced policies that pressured families to send their children away, sometimes through coercion, sometimes by threat, and in some cases, by force. Young children were taken hundreds of miles from home, placed into unfamiliar environments where everything they knew was stripped away. The separation was not just physical. It was emotional, cultural, and generational. Parents were left behind with silence, unsure when, or if, they would see their children again. Letters were rare. Communication was limited. For many, the absence created a quiet, lasting grief that spread through entire communities. Inside these institutions, life was rigid and controlled. Children were given new names. Their hair, often a symbol of identity and heritage, was cut. Speaking their native languages was punished. Traditions were forbidden. Even small acts of cultural expression could lead to discipline. The goal was not hidden. It was spoken openly in earlier years to kill the Indian and save the man. By the 1940s, that philosophy still shaped the system, even if its language had softened. And so, while Native soldiers wore the uniform of a nation overseas, their children were being reshaped into something that nation found acceptable. While they were fighting overseas, their children were being taken away in silence. This silence is what made the system so powerful and so devastating. There were no headlines, no public outcry, just families separated behind the cover of policy, and a generation of children growing up disconnected from who they were. When the war ended, the damage did not simply disappear. It remained in lost language, in broken connections, in stories that were not told for years. This was the hidden war at home, not fought with weapons, but with control over identity itself. And its impact would echo far beyond the battlefield, shaping generations that followed. As Native American soldiers stood on the front lines of World War II, fighting for the ideals of freedom and democracy, a contradiction unfolded, quiet, but impossible to ignore. These men wore the uniform of the United States. They followed orders, faced enemy fire, and, in many cases, gave their lives. Units like the Navajo Code Talkers became essential to the war effort, transmitting messages that could not be broken, helping secure key victories in the Pacific. Their bravery was undeniable, their loyalty unquestionable. But loyalty was not always returned with justice. Back home, federal policies rooted in assimilation did not pause for the war. The system of Indian boarding schools continued to operate, removing children from their homes and placing them into institutions designed to reshape their identity. The goal remained consistent: to replace native culture with something the government considered acceptable. So while native soldiers were defending freedom abroad, their own families were navigating control at home. This is the bitter contradiction. The same government that relied on native men to help win a global war was still enforcing policies that limited the cultural and personal freedoms of their people. On reservations, life remained tightly regulated. Economic hardship persisted, and for many families, the fear of losing their children to boarding schools was not a distant possibility, it was a reality. There was no pause, no exception made for those serving overseas. Imagine carrying a weapon in defense of a nation, while knowing that your own child might be forced into a system designed to erase their identity. Imagine fighting for liberty in another country, while your own community lived under restrictions that denied full expression of who they were. How do you fight for freedom when your own freedom is being taken at home? For many native soldiers, this question did not have a simple answer. Their service was not driven by blind trust in government policy. It was rooted in something deeper: honor, responsibility, and a belief that their actions might create a better future, even if the present was filled with contradiction. And yet, when the war ended, the reality they returned to had not changed as much as they had hoped. The uniforms came off. The battlefield was left behind. But the policies remained. This moment in history reveals something uncomfortable, but necessary to understand. Patriotism and injustice existed side by side. Native Americans fought for the ideals of a nation, even when those ideals were not fully extended to them. That is the contradiction, and it is a truth that still echoes today. What happened to Native children during and beyond World War II did not end when the war was over. The consequences did not fade with time. They settled into families, into communities, and into generations that would carry the weight of what was lost. Because this was never only about removal, it was about transformation. For decades, systems like the Indian boarding schools worked to disconnect children from their roots at the most critical stage of their lives. Language was one of the first casualties. In many native cultures, language is more than communication. It carries history, spirituality, identity. When children were punished for speaking it, an entire way of understanding the world began to disappear. Some never relearned it. Others returned home unable to communicate with their own grandparents. Conversations that once passed down stories, traditions, and values were replaced with silence. And in that silence, something deeper was lost: the continuity between generations. This wasn't just about children. It was about an entire culture being reshaped. The impact extended far beyond language. Cultural practices, ceremonies, songs, ways of living were interrupted. Children raised in strict institutional environments were often taught to reject the very identity they came from. When they returned, many felt caught between two worlds, no longer fully connected to their traditions, yet not fully accepted into mainstream society either. This created a fracture, a cultural separation that was not always visible, but deeply felt. And over time, that fracture became generational. The term often used today is intergenerational trauma, the passing of emotional and psychological pain from one generation to the next. For many Native families, the boarding school experience contributed to patterns of disconnection, loss of identity, and unresolved grief. These were not isolated stories. They were shared across communities. Yet, this is not only a story of damage, it is also a story of survival. Despite everything, many Native nations held on to what they could. Elders preserved fragments of language. Traditions were practiced in private, passed down quietly, protected until they could be openly expressed again. In recent decades, there has been a growing movement to reclaim what was nearly erased: language revitalization programs, cultural education, and community healing efforts. The effects of the past are still present, but so is the resilience. Because even after generations of pressure to forget, Native communities are choosing to remember. After decades of pressure, removal, and silence, something remarkable remained: resilience. The systems that expanded through and beyond World War II were designed to break continuity, to separate children from families, to weaken identity, to replace culture with conformity. And in many ways, they caused deep and lasting damage. But they did not succeed in erasing what mattered most. Because culture is not only taught in institutions, it lives in people. Across Native communities, even at the height of assimilation policies, like the Indian boarding schools, families found quiet ways to resist. Traditions were preserved behind closed doors. Languages were whispered when no one else was listening. Stories were passed down in fragments, carefully, intentionally, so that something would survive. This was not loud resistance. It was not recorded in official reports, but it was constant. Elders became protectors of memory. Parents, even when separated from their children, held on to identity in whatever ways they could. And when those children returned, often carrying confusion, loss, and disconnection, families began the difficult work of rebuilding. It was not easy. Relearning language, reconnecting with traditions, restoring trust between generations. These were not quick victories, but slow, deliberate acts of healing. In many cases, it took years, sometimes lifetimes, to rebuild what had been interrupted. Yet, the effort never stopped. By the mid to late 20th century, a shift began to take shape. Native communities started to organize more visibly, protecting their rights, reclaiming their heritage, and challenging the systems that had tried to redefine them. Cultural revival was no longer hidden. It became a movement. Languages once suppressed began to be taught again. Ceremonies returned to open spaces. Younger generations, who had grown up distanced from their roots, began to seek them out with urgency and pride. This was more than preservation. It was restoration, and it continues today. Across Native nations, there are ongoing efforts to revitalize language, strengthen cultural education, and address the lasting effects of past policies. These are not just acts of remembrance, they are acts of survival, carried forward with intention. Despite everything, their spirit was never erased. That line is not symbolic. It is historical truth. Because even after removal, even after silence, even after generations of disruption, their identity remained. Not untouched, not unchanged, but alive. And that is what defines this chapter of the story. Not what was taken, but what endured. By the time the guns fell silent after World War II, the story of Native American service was already etched into history, but not always into memory. Across the United States, thousands of Native American soldiers returned home carrying more than medals. They carried experiences from battlefields, memories of sacrifice, and the quiet burden of everything left behind. Many had served with distinction, including members of units like the Navajo Code Talkers, whose contributions helped secure victory in ways that remained classified for years. But what awaited them at home was not the recognition they had earned. It was something more complex. Loyalty had defined their service. They wore the uniform, followed orders, and stood beside other Americans in defense of shared ideals. They believed in duty not just to a country, but to something larger than themselves. That belief is what drove them into battle. That belief is what kept them moving forward when the cost became real. And yet, beneath that loyalty was a deep and often unspoken reality. Sacrifice. Not just the sacrifice of those who did not return, but the sacrifice of identity, of family time, of connection. Many Native soldiers came back to communities already shaped by years of pressure and loss. Some returned to find their children changed, separated from language, culture, and in some cases, from the very identity that defined them. Others returned to find that the systems affecting their people had not paused in their absence. This is where the story becomes harder to carry, because alongside loyalty and sacrifice sits a third truth. Betrayal, not always in intention, but in outcome. While Native Americans contributed heavily to the war effort, the policies that affected their communities, like the continuation of Indian boarding schools, did not stop. The same nation that depended on their courage abroad did not fully protect their communities at home. They fought for America, but America failed to fight for them. That line is not just emotional, it reflects a historical contradiction that cannot be ignored. It is the tension between service and recognition, between contribution and protection, between being needed and being seen. And for many Native Americans, this contradiction did not end with the war. It continued into post-war life, shaping conversations about rights, identity, and justice for decades to come. Yet, even in this truth, there is something important to understand. Their story is not only one of loss, it is also one of resilience. Because despite everything, the war, the policies, the silence Native communities endured, and in their endurance, they left behind a powerful reminder. Loyalty should never require invisibility, and sacrifice should never come without recognition. That is the truth, and it still matters today. History is often told in victories, dates, and outcomes. But some stories live in what lingers afterward, in the questions that refuse to go away. The experience of Native Americans during and after World War II is one of those stories. Because this is not just history. This is truth. It is the truth of thousands who stepped forward to serve a nation, carrying values rooted in honor, community, and responsibility. It is the truth of men who wore the uniform, fought in distant lands, and contributed to a global victory, including those in units, like the Navajo Code Talkers, whose voices became a weapon that helped shape the outcome of the war. But it is also the truth of what was happening at the same time far from the battlefield. While these men served, policies like the Indian boarding schools continued to reshape Native communities from within. Children were separated from families. Languages were suppressed. Identity was challenged in ways that would leave lasting effects across generations. These are not separate stories. They are the same story. And when you place them side by side, a deeper question begins to form, one that goes beyond the past and speaks directly to the present. What does loyalty mean when it is not returned? For many Native Americans, loyalty was never conditional. It was expressed through action, through service, through sacrifice, through standing in moments when it mattered most. But recognition did not always follow. Protection was not always guaranteed. And the promises tied to freedom were not always equally shared. That is the tension this history leaves behind. Not just what happened, but what it reveals. It reveals that patriotism can exist alongside injustice. That service does not always result in fairness. And that the meaning of loyalty becomes more complex when it is met with silence, or worse, contradiction. Yet, even in that complexity, there is something that endures. The truth did not disappear. Today, more people are listening. More stories are being told not as fragments, but as full narratives that carry both pride and pain. Native communities continue to speak, to preserve, and to reclaim what was nearly lost. And in doing so, they ensure that this history is not buried, but understood. Because remembering is not just about the past. It is about responsibility. If this story moved you, share it. Because some stories must never be forgotten.